Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 0 of the Philosopher's Couch. In this episode, I'm going to basically introduce the series, talk a little bit about, what the series is, what it is I'm up to in this series. I'll talk about a little bit about why it is I'm doing this series. What the impetus was for me deciding to have guests on the proverbial philosopher's couch here. What the impetus was again for me deciding to do that. I'll talk a little bit about my strategy for the series. I definitely, who knows what this is going to look like come episode 50 if we ever get there, right? But I do have, a general game plan going into this series. This is something that I've kind of had in the back of my mind for a while now, and have had a chance over, the months that I've had my channel going. I've had this sort of series in the back of my mind. I've had a few months to kind of ruminate on what exactly I'd like to do, and so. I do have a kind of game plan, like I said, going into the series. Who knows, like I said, what it'll look like, come 20 episodes in. But I'll talk a little bit about at least what I have in mind going into it. And then I want to outline kind of what you can expect episode to episode, what I have in mind in terms of each episode, what it's going to look like, right? So I'm going to sit down and talk philosophy, as you'll see here in a moment when I elaborate on what this episode is, right? I'm going to sit down and talk philosophy with someone. But what exactly is that going to look like? So I'll go through, I have actually some various segments in mind, and so I'll outline exactly what I plan to do in each of these particular segments with each of the guests. So that's the game plan for this introductory episode, if you will, episode 0. So let's go ahead and dive in. What is it that I plan, or what is this particular series? What am I doing here? Basically, in this series, you're going to stop hearing so much from me on my channel, right, but actually then hear from other people. So this is a series where, again, you won't hear me. You will hear me. It'll be a kind of a conversation, but you're going to hear a lot from other people, whoever the guest happens to be. We're going to focus on them in particular, and you're going to hear all about what they have to say regarding the big philosophical questions and maybe the minor philosophical questions as well. So the whole gist of it, or the idea is, we're going to get a kind of feel for what the average everyday person thinks of philosophy, or at least various selections of average everyday people, what they think of philosophy, what they think of some of these big questions that you might have heard me ramble on about it at various points in my videos. What do average everyday people think of these issues, right? So obviously, this is something I care about deeply. It's something I've made a career out of, right? I mean, I teach philosophy, but again, the idea is here in this series, we're going to focus on people that have not done that who don't have degrees in philosophy, who I think all of us are, I guess this is maybe debatable, but I think at some point in our lives, almost all of us have probably been philosophical, if you will, right? We've asked the deep questions, but very few of us actually make it our livelihood, if you will. And so, like me, for example. And so, again, this series is going to cater to or focus on the average everyday person who, again, I think anyway, tends to be philosophical, but again, doesn't earn their paycheck teaching philosophy. So that's what the series amounts to. So why am I doing this? Well, to be honest, I'm very philosophical in nature, obviously, right? I'm a professor of philosophy, so it interests me, to say the least. And so, admittedly, this is satisfying my own philosophical desire, right? Just to sit down and chat about these things that interest me from the get-go. And one of the things that might come up, right, is that this is one of the things I've struggled with over my life, because I end up on this couch talking about this sort of thing all the time, and other people don't necessarily want to be doing that, right? So, for example, if I'm at a party, right, whether it's 20 years ago, right, or today, chances are, if I had my way, it'll end up me chatting with somebody, about the deep questions. And again, not everyone likes to do that, at least not all the time, or at least not as much as I like to. So, admittedly, from the outset, I will concede that this offers me an opportunity to, talk shop, so to speak, to chat about the things that really do interest me, that I think about all the time, seriously, all the time. So, um, it's always something that I will entertain, sitting down and chatting about the deep questions. So why this series? That's obviously one of the main reasons is it satisfies one of my interests. I want to hear what others think about these questions that I myself wrestle with all the time, and I think it will be interesting. I really do look forward to hearing. Obviously, I've read a lot in philosophy. I've heard what academic philosophers, if you will, many academic philosophers, what they've had to say about these deep issues over the years. But I am intrigued to hear just what family and friends and average everyday people that I encounter, what they also think about some of these same issues. And who knows, maybe even strangers down the road. Maybe episode 42 will have, I'll just go up to some random stranger and ask them to be on an episode, and then hear what they have to think about all these deep questions. So um, I am very intrigued to find out sort of what others think about some of these same kind of issues that I've thought a lot about myself. So that's definitely one of the things I had in mind with respect to this series. It does offer so another sort of thing I'm trying to satisfy, if you will, is I feel like on my channel you hear a lot from me, whether it be my lecture videos for my courses, or other series where my book musings, where you're hearing my thoughts on these various books. It's a lot of me, but maybe you're interested in the same philosophical sort of stuff, but you'd like kind of a break from me, or at least hear a little less from me. And so this will obviously offer an opportunity for that. You're going to get the same sort of philosophical fix, if you will, but it's going to be provided by others and not so much by me. Now, I will be obviously part of the conversation. I'm going to be steering it, if you will, so you'll still hear a lot from me. But obviously, this is going to provide a means for my viewers to then hear from other people as well. So I look forward to that. And honestly, so another major sort of thing I hope to achieve with this series, as I've heard, several people mention, some close friends, they would love to hear like a podcast, me do a kind of podcast where it's not necessarily again me giving my lectures, but it's kind of more of a conversation with someone else where it's a back and forth, and maybe I give some of my views and then they give some of their views and so on. To do that, and who knows, maybe down the road, maybe that's a possibility. Maybe you'll have a podcast for me. Who knows? But in the interim, to me, this felt like a nice little compromise, because you're still getting that kind of conversation that you get with the podcast, or that conversational vibe that you get with the podcast. But in the meantime, I don't have to invest a lot of my resources and time right now, when I don't have a lot, into like learning about podcasts and how to do that. I've already had to tinker with these videos, and I'm already on YouTube and have this platform established because of my courses. And so this allows me, I guess it's kind of a compromise in the sense that it's easier for me to do because I'm already familiar with this platform and so on. And it also satisfies some of the things I think these people that recommended the podcast, what they were yearning for, right? More of a conversational feel. Maybe get some people questioning me a little bit. And you will see that happening in this series. So again, I feel like who knows what's down the road. Maybe a podcast is coming eventually, but in the interim, I think this is kind of a nice compromise. Again, it's something that I can easily do now, given what I've already had to do with my courses, right? I'm kind of getting a little bit more experience with doing these videos. So it's a little bit easier for me, and it does, again, sort of satisfy what I think they were going for in terms of wanting that podcast, that conversational sort of feel, the back and forth. Again, I hope to accomplish that with this particular series. Okay, and I guess I'd end with just kind of pointing out that, I kind of alluded to this already. It's just going to be fascinating to me, over time as we accumulate these various episodes. just to get kind of a profile of what everyone thinks, from all these various walks of life, what everyone thinks about these same essential existential questions that face us all, right? That we all, maybe at some various points in our lives, I like to think anyway, that we lie awake in bed at night thinking about, wondering about. I can't wait to kind of get a sort of perspective of what all these, various people think about these issues. So I'm really looking forward to that. Again, I'm planning on, episode one will be with, one of my best friends who's the best man in my wedding. So obviously friends, family, but who knows, where this series will take us. Strangers down the road, maybe I'll end up meeting someone and then an hour later saying, "Hey, would you like to come on and do an episode for a series I do?" I can envision that. Who knows? Other philosophers. Who knows what this series will bring? But anyway, that's kind of the why behind, or the impetus behind, why it is I'm coming to do this. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the strategy, or sort of things I had in mind coming into the series. Again, who knows where this is going to end up down the road? But what are some things I have in mind coming into the series? Okay. First and foremost, so on my channel, there's some more formal elements, and then there's some more informal sort of videos and elements, right? So my lecture videos I consider kind of formal, right? I try to do them just as you would if you took a course from me at Johnson County Community College, right? And you were to walk into a classroom. I want it to seem just as if it were happening, right? It's formal in that sense. And then I have other series. The Great Philosophical Abyss is another series I have on my channel, which is more informal, right? It's more laid back. You'll see me sort of not necessarily dressing in costume, but I have shades on in one episode, right? It's not as formal. It's more laid back, and you hear me not necessarily telling you what Thomas Hobbes thought, but you actually hear more of my own thoughts as well. So this series, The Philosopher's Couch, is going to be more like the latter, the Great Philosophical Abyss series, versus the former, my lectures, right? My video lectures. This is going to be more informal. Okay, I want the guest to be. We're going to be talking about deep stuff. Okay, and not, I get nervous talking about this stuff. I can't imagine average everyday people who haven't talked a lot about this stuff, nonetheless in front of a camera. I can't imagine how nervous they get. So I want to make it as informal as possible, just to make them as comfortable as possible, right, for the series. I think that is definitely a good idea. So again, nothing too formal. We're going to, proceed in a very laid back fashion. The guest is going to kind of steer each episode. I can just think of my friends, right? Some of them are going to be terse and much more to the point and eager to just get going, maybe. And others, we could be here for a lot longer, right? So the guest is going to steer things, right? Again, I want them to feel as comfortable as possible, chatting about things that are pretty deep and that not everybody's comfortable talking about. So again, it's going to have a kind of informal vibe, if you will, and the guest is really going to steer the show, if you will. They're going to dictate kind of how long or short it ends up being. They might even decide that they don't want to answer a particular question. And you know what? I'm not going to necessarily push them on a particular question either. So I just wanted to point that out as well, that, from the outset, I want to mention that a lot of appreciation, I'll echo this here in a moment, for the guests, and I'm going to do whatever I can to make it as comfortable as possible for whoever I have on for each episode, to make them as comfortable as possible. Because again, what we're talking about is not, who's going to win the Super Bowl sort of thing, right? Episode one, we had a chat about who's possibly going to see it, right? Because not only is it's one thing to like be able and be comfortable expressing your views, but then you have to think about who might potentially see it, right? And so all these things are things that are definitely weighing on my guests' minds, and I definitely have an appreciation for that. So again, I want to make things as laid back as possible, as comfortable as possible for each of these guests, and again, that sort of informal vibe I think is going to go a long way, right, toward relaxing them and getting them in a position where they're going to be more likely to be willing to elaborate on some of these deep, sensitive topics. Okay. Um, I don't have a set schedule or plan. A lot of YouTubers are like, I'm going to have an episode every Tuesday. No. You know, if I think of somebody who I'm like, oh, that person would be really interesting to sit down and get on the philosopher's couch, well, then I'm going to do my best to get them on the couch. Or maybe somebody who sees this, right? If you're interested, who knows? People come to me and want to get on the philosopher's couch. However it ends up happening, that's the way it's going to happen. I don't have a set schedule or plan going into this, is basically the gist of that point. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of, I guess, the game plan, not specifically yet the segments, but kind of the feel I wanted to have for the episodes and the series in general. So I wanted to kind of have some consistency across episodes. I thought it would be interesting to sort of be able to compare what people thought by asking them the same questions across various episodes. So you will see definitely some consistency in terms of that. And I'll mention as we go through the segments here in a moment which ones are going to be consistent and which ones are going to sort of fluctuate from guest to guest. Okay, so that was definitely, point being here, that was definitely something I had in mind, right? I want some elements of consistency so that we can kind of compare and contrast, right? We have some elements that are the same, right? That we can then sort of compare and contrast various guests on each episode. Okay? But other segments are going to be different, right? I want to make things interesting too, right? So each episode, it's not necessarily going to be the same questions, right? So there'll be segments, and more on that in a moment, where it will be different from guest to guest. So, and I think it's like basically a 50-50 ratio where half of what we're doing will end up being like similar questions from guest to guest, and then half of it will be different or possibly different from guest to guest. And so I also wrestled with this sort of issue. I wanted to kind of emulate a spontaneous kind of conversation you might have with a really good friend on a Friday night, or is today a Saturday night, right? So that's going to be spontaneous in some sense, right? But on the other hand, this is deep stuff, and so I wanted the conversation to be calculative, deliberative, right? I mean, I want these responses to some sort of thinking going behind them. So the point is, like, I wrestled kind of with how much to present to each guest before they come on the philosopher's couch, how much to tell them in terms of what to expect. And I really decided ultimately I wanted to err on the side of being spontaneous and just having a whatever happens sort of feel. So they already know it's philosophy, right? They know in general they're coming on the philosopher's couch. It's going to be deep stuff. So I figure already they're going to sort of have general sort of idea of what we might talk about, right? And be able to kind of game plan in general, given that. But I didn't want them to really know much more than that. So I decided, I guess I erred on the side of spontaneity, right? And I wanted it to have that kind of spontaneous feel, like a conversation where you're not necessarily knowing what's going to come next. Okay, so basically, so the point here is these guests, and so these guests will know that, hey, you're coming on the philosopher's couch. We're going to talk about some deep stuff, but they're not going to know much more than that. I might allude to like some of the segments. So look, for example, one of the first segments you'll talk about how we know each other, right? Background segment, and we'll talk about some big questions. I might mention that. And I might mention, hey, some questions are going to be tailored to who you are in particular and what you do for a living. I'm going to mention some of these very general things. But beyond that, that's honestly all I'll mention. And I've already recorded episode 1, and that's literally exactly how we proceeded. So Jamie Kramer, get the guest for episode 1. That's all he really knew. That there would be like a background sort of segment. We're going to talk about some of the deep questions. Those will be the consistent ones from guest to guest. They'll all answer. And so he kind of helped me think about what some of those might be actually on our road trip out to Colorado actually. But beyond that, I said, I admitted to him, I want this to be something that's spontaneous, and so I don't want you to know a lot about it. And so, I mentioned as well that there would be a few questions about what he does, but beyond that, he didn't know anything. And so I want to point that out, that these guests, beyond knowing that it's a philosophy channel, we're going to talk the deep issues. We're going to talk about the deep issues. Beyond that, they really aren't going to know anything in particular. And having that in mind, then, as I alluded to before, all the more reason to give a shout out to all my guests at the outset. Much love, much appreciation. This is not going to be easy. Imagine, right, if you don't have to do this, imagine having to do it, where you're going to come on, who knows who's going to see it, right? Who knows what Dr. Musil is going to ask you, or Brad, if you know me that way, what he's going to ask you. And you have to, on the spot, more or less, be able to kind of respond and hopefully offer a fairly insightful response. Not going to be easy. So, again, that was the kind of upshot of having that spontaneous quality, is that the guest won't be able to prepare as much, versus if I had told them specifically the exact questions they're going to get, then they're going to be able to prepare more, right? But I think this will be more interesting overall. It'll be tougher for the guests, and so again, my whole point here is I want to emphasize just how much I appreciate the guests and acknowledge from the outset this will not be easy. But again, I think it'll be a better overall sort of experience, right? A more natural kind of conversation if we don't go into it completely, rehearsed. So let's see. Yeah, I think I've emphasized enough how much I appreciate the guest taking a seat on the Philosopher's Couch. So, by the way, this is the Philosopher's Couch. I hope to get rid of it very soon. I hate this couch, actually. I've been discussing with my wife that we need to get rid of it for many years now. I don't actually sit on this couch that often because I hate it that much. But it is the Philosopher's Couch for now. And actually, episode 1, we're gonna go ahead and go somewhere else to a different Philosopher's Couch. And I guess it's one of the things I'm going to mention is that, hey, there's no set location for the Philosopher's Couch either. If it's here, if I have guests that are local here in Kansas City, they'll probably be here. But episode 1's in Breckenridge, right? So the Philosopher's Couch is going to end up taking many shapes and forms and sizes, if you will. So this is what you can expect more often than not, but not always. Okay, so anyway, let's go ahead then. I guess the last thing I want to do is kind of outline. So I've given you some general thoughts of my strategy going into the series, some things I had in mind. Again, who knows what it's going to look like 10, 20, 30 episodes, if we even get that far, right? But how it's going to look like that far in. But I do have a game plan going into it. I want to talk now specifically about each particular segment. So I do have, they end up being 8, I think. 8. Some of these are very basic, so 8 segments, if you will, but like introduction and conclusion, those are segments. So I came up with basically 8 segments that I'll cover very briefly here that are going to comprise each episode. So without further ado, the first segment is going to be the introduction, and this is going to, and I will outline, by the way, as we go through each of these segments, which ones are going to be, as I alluded to earlier, which ones are going to be sort of the same from episode to episode, and which segments are going to feature things that will, like questions that will be different from episode to episode. So the introduction is going to be the same, right? So in other words, I'll ask each guest the same questions in this particular segment. So this segment, the introduction, right, we'll learn who the guest is and where they're from, what the guest does, and what their interests are. So, hopefully they'll elaborate a little bit on, again, what they do for a living and what they like to do for fun. So what are some of their hobbies. And then also want to include in this background or this introduction segment how they know me, obviously, if at all, right? So who knows, maybe someday we'll have a stranger or two on the series, but my guess is that most of these guests will know me in some fashion, right? So how do they know me? Okay, that will also be included in this segment. Then segment 2 is their philosophy background. So this will be the same in the sense that each guest will be asked the same questions. Now, obviously, their background's going to be different. Okay, so, but this particular segment will be the same. You know, what questions I ask from guest to guest, episode to episode will be the same. So, segment 2, philosophy background. Basically, I'm going to ask question 1, what philosophy means to them. What is philosophy? And it's always curious to me, you know, a lot of times just the debates we can have about what philosophy even is. Right? So before we get into philosophy or what we think is philosophy, what is philosophy? So I'll ask the guest, what does philosophy mean to them? Then I'll ask how philosophical they are. Right? So given what they think philosophy is, how philosophical would you say you are? Okay. Then third, what do they think of philosophy? So they have this idea of what philosophy is. They have this impression of how philosophical they are. And then this third sort of element, what do they actually think of philosophy, the process of doing philosophy? Is it worthwhile? Is it futile? That sort of thing. And then fourth, I like to ask who their favorite philosopher is. And then, you know, if that's a struggle, which it might be for some people, can they even name a philosopher? So who's your favorite philosopher, or can you even name a philosopher? And then finally, the fifth question, right, the philosophical background, that second segment. Are there particular philosophical questions or areas that are of utmost interest to the guest, right? So I'll ask them to identify particular branches or areas or questions within philosophy that seem particularly interesting to them. Okay. Then we'll move on to the third segment, which I look forward to, called the big questions, which I call the big questions. This will be the same from guest to guest, episode to episode, in the sense that I ask the same questions. Now the conversation and their responses are going to be different, obviously, right? But they'll be the same questions. So question 1 is going to be, this is the one that got me started. Why is there something and not nothing? This is the question that got me started in philosophy, you know, decades ago, way back, you know, early high school. So I'll ask my guest, you know, what their answer is if they have one to why is there something and not nothing. The second big question I'll ask is what's the meaning of life, or why are we here? And so I'll have two different ways of framing that, but getting at that same sort of issue, what's the meaning of life, or why are we here? That's sort of big question number 2. Big question number 3 then is going to be, does morality exist? Okay, and if it does, how do we figure out what it is, right? So does morality exist? Is there a certain way I should behave? And if the answer is yes, how do I figure that out? Okay. The fourth big question will be, are we ultimately free or are we determined? Okay. And if my guests are anything like my first guest, what I'll end up doing is saying something like, granted you might not know, which way do you lean? So hopefully I'll remember to do this on each of these, because a lot of my guests, I have a feeling, might say, I don't know, right? So I'll try to get them one way or another, like I do on my other series, The Great Philosophical Biz, where I try to make myself come off the proverbial philosophical fence. I'll try to make my guests do so as much as I can, right? So the fourth one again, are we ultimately free or are we determined? Okay. And then fifth, the final big question, what is really happening? Is this a simulation? Is it all physical stuff, and then when we die, that's it? Does it all come down to my perceptions? Is it all mental, if you will, or come down to my perceptions, and when I die, that's it? There's nothing else that continues to exist. What's really happening? And I'll ask the guest what their response is to that. So those are the big questions again, the 5 big questions. That's segment 3. What are they again? Why is there something and not nothing? What's the meaning of life, or why are we here? Does morality exist, and how do we figure it out? Are we ultimately free or are we determined? And what is really happening? Then the fourth segment, so the first 3, background or sort of introduction, who the guest is, how we know each other, then philosophical background, segment 2, and then the big question, segment 3. Those are all going to be consistent or the same from guest to guest, right? In the sense that I'm going to ask the same things. But then starting with segment 4, things will get a little different. So segment 4 is going to be guest-focused questions. So this is where I'm going to take into account the particular person I have on the philosopher's couch and ask them a question or two that are specifically tailored to them. Okay. So again, that is segment 4. And that will be different from guest to guest. And actually, all of the rest will pretty much be different. So the first 3 are going to be the same. Again, the conversation and their answers are going to be different, but the questions I ask them will be the same in the first 3 segments. And then the last 5 segments, starting with this last one I just mentioned, segment 4, the guest-focused questions, they're all going to be different from episode to episode. So segment 5, so I mentioned segment 4 is the guest-focused questions. There's probably going to be 1 or 2 guest-focused questions. Segment 5 is going to be the Great Philosophical Abyss. So you've heard me reference my other series called The Great Philosophical Abyss. Segment 5 is also called The Great Philosophical Abyss. And what this is basically, this goes back to when I first started teaching. I would begin classes by asking the students to name off a number, depending on how many questions I had in the Great Philosophical Abyss, let's say 75. I would ask them to name off a number between 1 and 75. Whatever number that was, one of the students named off, 32. I would read off the question then that corresponded to question 32, mark it off so we wouldn't do it again later in the semester, read it out loud. They would then take a few moments to think about the question as I would go through and take roll. Once I got done with the roll, I would then open it up and we would talk about that particular question from the Great Philosophical Abyss. The students loved it. Over time, I came to appreciate that I just didn't have time to do the Great Philosophical Abyss, which was sad for me because the students always loved it so much. It was a great way to kind of get warmed up. They weren't necessarily, some of them are super deep, but not all of them. They range in terms of how deep they are, how serious they are, right? From not so serious at all to very, very serious. And it was just a nice way to get warmed up and get in the mood to do philosophy, if you will. And so I always have a fond memory of that. And so this kind of harkens back to that. And so what I'll do in this segment is I will go back to this same list of questions I used back in the day, and I will expand upon it. And by the way, one of the things I want to invite you to do if you see this is if you have a question or issue you think would be a nice addition to the Great Philosophical Abyss, let's hear it. You can add it to the comments, and who knows, I might add it. So this is an ever-expanding list, but basically the Great Philosophical Abyss is a numbered list of philosophical topics, questions, or issues, however you want to put it. And this will be randomized. I'll mix it up before every guest. So even if they've heard like a previous episode and what somebody said 32, it won't necessarily be this. It won't necessarily be the same question, right? So let me just give you an example of the question. Question 20 from the list I printed off. And by the way, some of these are taken from particular sources. So for example, this one is borrowed from the Book of Questions by Gregory Stock, PhD. Some of them are taken from askphilosophers.org. Okay. So question 20 is, which is more important, actual experiences or the memories that remain when the experiences are over? So that's just an example, right? So what will happen in this 5th segment, the Great Philosophical Abyss segment, is I'll ask the guest to name 3 different numbers. So, it was going to be 3 to 5. I've already done episode 1. 3 is a good number. So we're going to do 3 questions from the Great Philosophical Abyss. So I'll say, name off a number. Let's say they did 20. Boom, I read it off, and we'll get their response. We'll do the same thing again, and then again for a 3rd one. So that's how the Great Philosophical Abyss is going to work. Again, it's going to be randomized each time, and it will be an ever-growing list. I love to add on to this. If you have a good idea that you want to add to the list, of course, it's going to be hard for you to know whether it's on the list already, but feel free to throw it out there in the comments as well. Okay, so that was the 5th segment or element of each episode. The 6th segment, and I guess this will be the same. Okay, so I take back kind of what I said earlier. This is going to be another element that will be the same. Basically, I'm going to say, the Socratic Genie grants you 3 wishes. So, boom, tell me what are your 3 wishes. So that'll be super quick. Kind of interesting, what does this guest really want in life, if you will. Throw that at them. And then the 7th segment, this will be different based on each guest, is going to be, and who knows, it might be 0 seconds, right? They might not have any questions for me, or it might take as long as the rest of the episode. Basically, this is going to be uh, AMA or AMAP, if you will, ask me anything philosophically, right? So this is going to be an opportunity for the guest to flip things around, and especially the ones that have known me, maybe they've always been kind of wondering something about me or wanting to ask me something philosophically. Well, this will be their opportunity, right? So we'll flip things around. And I'll say, do you have anything you've been wanting to ask me philosophically, or do you have any questions for me, or things you'd like to discuss in terms of philosophy? So this will be their opportunity then to ask me whatever they want. Anything goes. For the seventh segment, again, ask me anything philosophically. That's the seventh segment. And then finally, we'll conclude with a conclusion, which I guess will be relatively the same across guests, right? We'll just say how well things went, because obviously they're going to go great. The guests won't have a nervous breakdown. I won't have a nervous breakdown. Everyone's going to have a lot of fun. We're going to gain some deep insights into a lot of these questions. Or if it goes anything like episode 1, maybe we'll find ourselves asking more questions. Who knows, right? That tends to be the way it goes sometimes in philosophy. That seemed to be the moral of episode 1, actually, is that maybe the upshot of philosophy is that you end up asking more questions than receiving answers or coming to answers. Who knows? But we'll conclude somehow each episode. And so that'll be the 8th segment. Okay, so that's, in a nutshell, what you can expect from each of these episodes. Again, that's the game plan coming in. So in this particular episode 0 of The Philosopher's Couch, I've talked to you about what the series is, what I'm doing, right? Talking shop, philosophically, if you will, with average everyday people about philosophical issues. I've talked about why it is I'm coming to do this series, why it interests me. I've talked about some of the general sort of strategical things I've had in mind, at least from the outset, the things I want to try to achieve with the series. And then I've talked a little bit about the particular segments, right, that will comprise each episode. At least going into it, kind of what I have in mind, how each episode will look. So that's what we've done in this first episode, which is actually episode 0 of the Philosopher's Couch. I'm already confusing it with the Great Philosophical Abyss. Hopefully you've enjoyed this introductory episode, and next time you hear from me, we'll be chatting with Jamie Kramer for episode 1 of The Philosopher's Couch. Thank you.